When the Altasar Empire conquered the fifth planet of the Vortis system in just under a week, no one in the Imperial leadership found it surprising. The Empire had a flawless track record, 15 consecutive conquests across the galaxy, all carried out under the same straightforward philosophy: arrive, demand surrender, obliterate anyone who refused, and plant the Altasar banner in the smoking remains. For centuries, this formula had made them a dominant force known for their lavish victory parades and brutal suppression tactics. The notion that a lesser species might challenge them was almost laughable. And so, when a delegation of humans arrived at the gates of the Empire's capital station requesting peaceful dialogue, Altasar barely took notice. Humans, after all, were widely dismissed as physically fragile and technologically behind. What threat could they possibly pose? The first meeting between the Altasar leadership and the human ambassadors took place in a grand ceremonial hall that was, by design, meant to strike awe and fear into visitors. Tall pillars carved from dark stone rose to the domed ceiling, illuminated by flickering orbs of pale green plasma. Along the walls, trophies from conquered worlds were proudly displayed. Weapons, flags, and even the petrified remains of deposed monarchs, all serving as silent reminders of what happened to civilizations that dared defy the Empire. The humans, however, seemed curiously unfazed. They stepped forward with easy smiles, dressed in unassuming suits. No armor, no visible weapons, no sign of advanced personal shielding. They carried small containers, apparently gifts, and offered them to the Emperor's council like it was the most natural gesture in the universe. Grand Marshal Navarth, leader of the Empire's armed forces, was the first to speak. Tall, broad-shouldered, clad in obsidian-colored ceremonial armor etched with the insignia of his rank, he projected an aura of menace earned from decades of conquest. His voice echoed in the hall. "We receive your offering, humans, though you should know that to approach us uninvited is considered an act of impertinence." The lead human ambassador, he called himself Daniel Morgan, did not flinch. Instead, he bowed with impeccable politeness and launched into a prepared statement about fostering trade alliances and mutual understanding. The entire council exchanged looks of mild confusion and amusement. Trade alliances? Mutual understanding? This, from a species whose starships were rumored to run on archaic fusion reactors and whose soldiers wore only rudimentary body armor. Yet, out of courtesy, or perhaps sheer curiosity, Navarth gestured for Morgan to continue. Morgan described Earth's interest in forging beneficial economic ties. They had medical research to share, new forms of entertainment, cultural artifacts, even culinary items that might please Altasar palates. The idea was that the Empire would gain access to human innovations without having to forcibly subjugate them. Emperor Ceres, the official head of state, though most real power belonged to Navarth, simply let out a low grunt and waved a hand. The Emperor had grown bored. For him, negotiations were usually just a tedious step before planetary bombardment. But he allowed the conversation to proceed because the humans' approach was, if nothing else, unusual. When the humans mentioned something about coffee, some lesser officials scoffed at the idea that the delegation would bring beverages as a peace offering. But Morgan's mild-mannered sincerity was disarming. He spoke of Earth's diverse climates, different ways of preparing beverages, and how they often found that sharing a meal or a drink paved the way for better diplomatic discourse. The mention of coffee drew polite smiles or baffled stares from the Altasar side, but one officer, General Baroth, couldn't help noticing that the humans seemed keenly interested in the architecture of the hall. Their eyes flicked to the energy conduits in the ceiling, the gravitational stabilizers near the door, even the security drones floating near the perimeter. Baroth, whose role focused on intelligence and counterespionage, felt a small spark of caution in the back of his mind. Though physically unimpressive, the humans had an alertness that was out of place for mere, friendly negotiators. He noted how they appeared to commit details of the hall's layout to memory, how they recognized the presence of hidden guard positions without any visible scanning devices. When the meeting concluded, the humans left behind small samplings of Earth's delicacies, this so-called coffee among them, and politely asked permission to remain in the capital station's diplomatic quarters for a few cycles. Navarth approved, seeing no harm in letting them stay. They would, after all, learn their place soon enough. The day after the humans were escorted to their guest wing, Barath received a minor security report from a watch officer. Apparently, one of the human assistants had been found wandering near the war hall's maintenance corridor, claiming he got lost. Lost, Barath repeated to himself, looking at the layout map. To get from the guest wing to that corridor, one had to make a specific series of decisions at each intersection. It wasn't a single wrong turn. It was more like 6 or 7. The watch officer had accepted the explanation at face value, but Barath filed it away as suspicious. He requested that the watch officer quietly assign a tail to follow the humans. Meanwhile, the large-scale reception for the human delegation took place that evening. The Altasar side treated it as a spectacle, filling the hall with swirling lights, bombastic war anthems, and a lavish banquet set out on a sprawling black marble table. Bones of previous vanquished foes formed part of the table's decorative edges, something that would normally spark terror in less advanced species. The humans, though, simply admired the craftsmanship, raising more than a few eyebrows among the Imperial staff. More surprising was how quickly they adapted. They engaged in polite chit-chat, praising Altasar's architectural styles while fending off the more aggressive questions about Earth's military. No matter how many ways the officials tried to pry, the humans only shrugged and claimed that Earth's entire fleet was modest, built primarily for scientific exploration. Barath's suspicion only grew, but he kept silent for now. There was something about these humans that gnawed at him, the sense that they were far from the naive explorers they presented themselves to be. At the banquet's end, Ambassador Morgan promised that Earth would deliver proposals for joint trade routes, promising the Empire a share in Earth's budding technology and entertainment industries. Grand Marshal Navarth feigned polite interest. He was used to subservience, but if the humans were going to approach him with freebies, he wouldn't object, especially if it kept them docile until the Empire decided whether Earth was worth conquering. Navarth retired to his private chamber afterward, leaving the rest of the council to entertain the human delegation. Meanwhile, Barath made a discreet exit, heading toward the security center where he hoped to learn more about these curious visitors. As the cycles progressed, the humans immersed themselves in what they called cross-cultural exchange. They handed out small data crystals with recipes, music, and even short films from Earth. A portion of the Altasar administrative staff was charmed, intrigued by these weirdly approachable mammals. But for Barath and a handful of more cautious leaders, the charm was precisely the problem. More than once, the humans ventured into restricted corridors, always with the same excuse: sorry, got turned around. They managed to glance at the shield generator systems, the transporter bay, and even near the warship dock. Each time they were caught, the humans apologized profusely and slunk away without a fight. The repeated accidental sightings gradually peeled away any lingering notion in Barath's mind that they were incompetent. Accidents never happened so systematically. It was on the 10th day of the human stay that a young engineer named Colin found something lodged inside the ventilation system of a lower deck corridor. At first, he assumed it was debris from a recent upgrade to the station's air recyclers, but upon closer inspection, it appeared to be a crude device, not of Altasar design. Colin reported it to his supervisors, and eventually it landed on Barath's desk. The device seemed inactive, but it bore human manufacturing traits. Barath brought it to the intelligence lab for analysis. The report stated it was indeed a scanner or listening device, albeit with an outer shell that looked unbelievably simplistic by Altasar standards. Colin's scanning also detected trace signals that might have indicated it was capable of hooking into the station's data flow. The question was, how had it ended up there? Barath suspected that the humans had tried to plant it intentionally, or perhaps it was only a decoy while they planted more sophisticated devices elsewhere. He confronted Navarth, presenting the evidence of repeated suspicious incidents. Navarth initially scoffed, pointing out that the humans were obviously far behind the Empire in terms of weaponry. Yet as Baroth enumerated each infiltration attempt, each glimpsed blueprint, each corridor-lurking incident, a serious expression began to form on Navarth's face. The Grand Marshal was no fool. He recognized strategy when he saw it. If a weaker civilization wanted to undermine a stronger one, stealth and subtlety were exactly how they would do it. Despite his newfound caution, Navarth decided to watch and wait. It was possible that the humans were gleaning surface-level data, maybe hoping to keep the Empire from simply obliterating Earth. But in the back of Navarth's mind, the word espionage took root. The Empire had never met an enemy that fought in such a roundabout fashion. Altasar conquests were always straightforward. They never needed to hide. The possibility that the humans employed an entirely different approach to warfare was unsettling and intriguing. While Altasar's leadership mulled over how to respond, the humans continued their outward display of friendliness. They proposed small trade agreements that seemed to benefit the Empire. A few shipments of Earth-based pharmaceuticals that the Altasar scientists verified were indeed potent. Access to new entertainment channels that portrayed comedic scenes of Earth life, which many Altasar found bizarrely fascinating. Even the Emperor, typically uninterested in alien amusements, found himself chuckling at a bizarre Earth show about people forging alliances and then betraying each other for small sums of money. The comedic part, from an Altasar perspective, was that the entire scenario hinged on manipulation rather than brute force. Almost imperceptibly, a portion of the Empire's staff began to warm to the human presence. If these unassuming creatures could deliver such beneficial items, perhaps they were better kept around as allies or subordinates rather than forcibly conquered. For a few short cycles, it seemed to settle into an odd routine. The humans would politely ask for minor concessions, expanding their trade corridor, calibrating the universal translators more finely, adjusting the station's gravitational settings in their quarters to mimic Earth norms. And in exchange, they'd keep offering small gifts that were just alluring enough to make the arrangement seem mutually beneficial. Navarth allowed it, rationalizing that a contented subject was easier to manage than a rebellious one. But Baratha's intelligence division kept looking for the bigger picture, sensing that these small concessions might add up. Then came the day that changed everything. Acting on a tip from a low-level staffer, Baroth personally inspected a sealed data archive in the station's lower levels. This archive contained record from the Galactic Collective, a loose union of advanced societies that shared strategic data on known threats, criminals, and high-risk operatives. The Empire rarely consulted it because they rarely felt threatened, but Baroth had discovered references to human infiltration specialists while scanning older logs. Now, scanning deeper, Baroth uncovered a file that spoke of certain Earth operatives with a penchant for toppling governments from within. The file included references to entire star systems that had not been conquered by war, but which had collapsed in on themselves economically and politically, only to be reformed under Earth-friendly regimes. A single name in that file matched their lead ambassador, Daniel Morgan, who was listed under a different alias. According to the archive, Morgan had once been indicted by a now-extinct regime for orchestrating a no-shots-fired coup through psychological manipulation, misinformation, and infiltration of economic channels. The classification labeled him a potential war criminal, but not in the typical sense of using monstrous weapons or mass atrocities. Instead, it describes systemic subversion leading to total capitulation of enemy forces without direct conflict. In other words, Morgan specialized in making foes surrender without ever realizing they were in a war. Baroth felt his pulse pound. For the Empire, the idea of war criminals usually conjured images of generals who used planet-cracking bombs or toxic bioweapons. The concept that a war criminal might use propaganda, infiltration, or subtle sabotage was almost alien to them. And yet, here was the documented proof. He compiled his findings, sent an urgent summons to Navarth, and prepared to brief the rest of the council. If Morgan truly was what this archive claimed, then the humans had effectively placed a master strategist of infiltration at the Empire's doorstep, and the Empire had welcomed him with open arms. Navarth listened to Berith's revelations with a grim silence. Darila, the Empire's chief strategist, was present as well, scoffing at the notion that a physically weak species could pose a genuine threat. But as Baroth explained the pattern of infiltration attempts, the infiltration device discovered in the ventilation, the repeated accidents in restricted areas, and the newly discovered historical record of Morgan's operations, Darila's derision slowly turned into an uneasy frown. She recognized that while Altasar typically vanquished foes by overhead bombardment, these humans had apparently found a way to conquer through commerce and cunning. "So what do you propose we do?" Navarth asked Baroth at the end of the briefing, his voice laced with tension. "If we move to arrest these humans openly, we risk them taking advantage of our own systems. We don't even know how much. They've compromised." Baroth suggested caution. The humans might not have fully infiltrated the systems yet. Perhaps the Empire could stage an incident to test how extensive the infiltration was, or block all external communications from the humans to prevent them from calling for outside support. Darila recommended a more direct approach. Place them under arrest, extract their knowledge by force, and be done with it. Navarth wavered, torn between these two extremes. Ultimately, he decided to gather more evidence, but time would not be on their side. Unaware of, or perhaps indifferent to, the growing suspicion around them, the humans proceeded to propose yet another trade agreement. This time, they requested access to the outer ring of Altasar's shipping lanes, the so-called pink conduits. On the surface, it seemed innocuous. The humans only wanted faster routes to supply Earth's goods to nearby star systems. In exchange, they offered advanced medical knowledge gleaned from decades of Earth's research. Some Altasar officials were genuinely excited, especially the Science Council. Others, like Darila, found the request suspiciously convenient, since these pink conduits also passed near a half-dozen key supply outposts of the Empire's war machine. Baroth ordered a new set of intelligence sweeps. His teams discovered that human communications were encrypted with a type of quantum cipher that defied Altasar's best decoding attempts. The infiltration device they found in the ventilation system now seemed like just the tip of the iceberg. More scanning devices, designed to look like harmless scraps of metal, began popping up in maintenance shafts. Each time one was discovered, the humans had a plausible excuse. Perhaps it fell out of our service drones, or it must have gotten there during a routine cargo transfer. Baroth no longer believed a single word of it. Soon, frantic messages from Altasar's own intelligence outposts started coming in. They reported seeing human traders lobbying other star nations, forging alliances that seemed beneficial on the surface. But according to these outposts, it was Earth that always emerged with preferential terms. It was Earth that somehow landed exclusive mining rights on strategic minerals. It was Earth that negotiated absurdly favorable tariffs. And each time, local governments embraced it, lured by talk of Earth's cultural exchanges, technological sharing, and win-win diplomacy. Baroth pieced it all together, his mind reeling. The humans were not just infiltrating the Empire. They were positioning themselves across the entire galaxy to become indispensable. If Altasar tried to crush them now, Earth could leverage all those alliances to economically and politically isolate the Empire. The tension reached a fever pitch when Navarth demanded a formal hearing, requiring Ambassador Morgan to appear before the full council to address allegations of espionage. The hearing took place in what was known as the Hall of Conquerors, a massive chamber lined with statues of infamous adversaries the Empire had overthrown. Typically, these ceremonies were reserved for humiliating a defeated foe before final sentencing. That the humans were invited to speak there before being labeled as criminals was already an unusual level of courtesy by Altasar standards. But Navarth needed to maintain an air of diplomacy, at least until he understood the scope of the threat. Morgan and his closest aides arrived, wearing polite expressions. The council members were seated in an elevated half-circle, looking down at the humans. Navarth began, "We have reason to believe," he said, his voice booming and authoritarian, that your delegation has engaged in unauthorized activities on this station, including infiltration into restricted zones and possible tampering with our systems. How do you plead? The question was more for formality. Typical adversaries would be trembling. But Morgan merely folded his hands, an apologetic smile on his face, and said, "We apologize for any misunderstandings. Our only intention was to foster cooperation, which sometimes requires a thorough grasp of the environment." Navarth's gaze darkened. "What about the evidence that your devices have been found tapping into the station's data flow?" he continued. This was the moment Baroth had prepared for, expecting Morgan to deny everything. Instead, Morgan let out a soft chuckle. "You found those?" "Yes, we suspected your detection systems were top-notch. We wanted to see how quickly you'd catch them. Consider it a test." The brazen admission left the council stunned. Darila half rose from her seat in fury. "A test?" Morgan nodded calmly. "To see if the Empire's security was as formidable as its reputation. Frankly, we're relieved to discover it's better than we feared." There was a moment of shocked silence. The humans were not even trying to disguise their subterfuge. They were, in effect, turning the interrogation around, as if the real question was whether the Empire was worthy of their respect. Navarth bristled. "How dare you speak in such a tone? Our Empire has crushed civilizations for lesser offenses." Morgan inclined his head slightly. "I'm aware of that, Grand Marshal. But you'll find that crushing us is complicated." Baroth took that as his cue, stepping forward with a data tablet in hand. "You, Daniel Morgan, are recorded in the Galactic Collective Archives under an alias. You have orchestrated entire planetary downfalls without firing a single shot. Your methods involve covert infiltration, economic manipulation, political sabotage. And that, by definition, makes you a war criminal." His voice reverberated through the chamber, a formal accusation intended to shock or shame Morgan. But Morgan did not appear shamed. If anything, his gaze hardened. "And your Empire," he said softly, "has bombed thousands of worlds into submission, leaving billions dead. By many standards, that makes you war criminals, too." The air in the Hall of Conquerors grew thick. Council members exchanged uneasy glances. Altasar didn't typically debate moral equivalences. They simply imposed their will. But now they were confronted with a form of warfare they found dishonorable. Yet so far it had proven devastatingly effective. Morgan continued, "We do not deny that we've been strategic. But Earth's priority is to avoid direct conflict, if at all possible. If that requires subterfuge to demonstrate that war is unwinnable for the other side, we consider it a more humane alternative than planetary bombardment." Darila spat. "Humane? You dare lecture us on humanity when you engage in deception at every turn." Morgan turned to her, his expression unwavering. "Your Empire prides itself on intimidation and brute force. Ours has learned that the deadliest weapon is simply to reshape the battlefield of the mind. We are, in many ways, exactly who you think we are, dangerous individuals who have honed psychological warfare to its peak. But we didn't come here to conquer the Altasar Empire. We came here to integrate it into a new system, one where brute force alone doesn't dictate survival." As Morgan's words echoed, Navarth realized the Empire stood at a crossroads. He could order the humans' immediate arrest, but would that provoke the very meltdown Morgan hinted at? Baratha's intelligence reports suggested that Earth was deeply entrenched in the Empire supply lines already, and if they had alliances with other star nations, the consequences of going to open war could be catastrophic. Visibly seething, Navarth asked, "What do you want from us?" Morgan exchanged a knowing look with his aides, then addressed the entire council. "We want a stable galaxy. Your Empire, with all its raw power, is like a hammer that sees every problem as a nail. We propose an alternative. Expand your Empire's influence not through force, but through structured trade, open communication, and shared innovation. Become partners with Earth, and you'll see the galaxy become your ally rather than your fearful subordinate." The proposition was so contrary to the Empire's core doctrine that half the council members choked in disbelief. Darila snapped, "You want us to lay down our arms and sing peace songs with the lesser species? Morgan shook his head. Not quite. Keep your arms if you must, but you'll find that every time you use them, you jeopardize the intricate economic network we've built. That network can grant you technological leaps, new trade routes, and cultural expansion. Or it can crumble, leaving your empire isolated. The choice is yours. Navarth stared at him, hatred and begrudging respect warring in his eyes. He glanced at Barath, who gave a slight nod. They'd run the simulations. A war might let them occupy Earth for a short time, but the broader repercussions would bleed the Empire dry. Darila, who usually advocated military action, looked uncharacteristically pale, as if the final puzzle piece had slotted into place. They'd always assumed Rom might triumph over cunning. Now cunning had slipped a noose around the Empire's neck. In a slow, resigned tone, Navarth turned to the Council. It appears that forging a more cooperative relationship with Earth may be in our best interests, at least in the short term. He grimaced, clearly loathing the words. But to defy logic now was to risk the entire Empire's future. The Council erupted in murmured debate. Some wanted to fight to the end, upholding the Empire's honor. Others, mindful of the data, recognized that the end might mean the collapse of their economy, alliances, and power structure. Morgan made a polite half-bow, acknowledging Navarth's partial acceptance. We will happily arrange a more formal treaty. And once you see the benefits, we are confident you'll come to view our presence not as a threat, but as an opportunity. In that moment, Barath realized Morgan was winning not just the debate, but the entire war of ideas. He could see how easily Morgan had maneuvered them into a position where compliance felt like the only rational option. Following that tumultuous confrontation, the humans didn't flee. They remained in the station, smiling and offering more suggestions about how to mutually benefit each other, as if nothing unusual had happened. The Emperor's official stance became an uneasy truce with the Earth delegates, while Navarth's top advisors scrambled to figure out how to minimize their vulnerability. In the days that followed, intelligence teams scoured the station for more human devices. They found plenty. Some were placed near environmental controls, others in communication junctions. A few had direct hooks into the cargo manifest system, letting the humans know exactly where military shipments were headed. The infiltration was extensive. The strangest part of it all was that the infiltration seemed less about sabotage and more about knowledge. The humans rarely tried to damage systems. They simply wanted to know everything. As part of an internal compromise, the Empire's ruling council reached a decision. They would push for a new diplomatic arrangement, effectively letting Earth have certain trade privileges in exchange for restricting their ambassadors' movements. Morgan's response was gracious. He even offered to remove the infiltration devices if the Empire would implement a shared data channel to allow better cooperation. That the Empire would ever consider such a proposition would have been unthinkable only cycles ago, but now it seemed the lesser evil compared to an open breach that might topple them from within. Rumors spread among Altasar's citizenry about the dangerous cunning of the humans. Those more hawkish voices demanded that Navarth forcibly expel the visitors, or at least confine them to a heavily guarded sector. But each time the Empire considered it, Barath or Darila would present simulation after simulation showing the catastrophic fallout. For every direct measure the Empire took, the humans had a counter-move. Alliances with trade partners, supply chain manipulations, or data leaks that would undermine Altasar dominance. The silent war was already lost, it seemed. During this uneasy stalemate, Morgan and his aides carried on with politeness that bordered on insulting. They mingled with mid-level staff, taught them Earth games, or taught them how to brew coffee. They offered new designs for medical technology that ended up saving several key Altasar officials from a rare degenerative disease. Bit by bit, the notion that humans were purely malevolent war criminals became more complicated. They had, indeed, advanced a brand of psychological warfare so potent that a single infiltration team could bring an empire to its knees. And yet, they also brought cultural exchange, trade, and peaceful solutions to problems. It was as though Earth's priority was not to destroy Altasar, but to ensure that Altasar was integrated into Earth's broader network. For many in the Empire, that was a confusing moral quandary. Were these humans ruthless puppet masters or genuinely well-intentioned but manipulative strategists? Eventually, a final negotiation was scheduled, a smaller private meeting involving Morgan, Navarth, Barath, and a few of the Emperor's closest advisors. The Empire wanted an official treaty that would limit Earth's infiltration while granting certain concessions. Earth, in turn, wanted the Empire to formally endorse new trade routes and open certain sectors to Earth merchants. In a meeting chamber far less grandiose than the Hall of Conquerors, with only minimal ceremonial pomp, they gathered around a circular table. The tension in the air was thick but subdued. Navarth, arms folded, initiated the discussion. We are prepared to acknowledge that Earth's methods, though underhanded, have proven effective in forging new alliances. In exchange for you ceasing all clandestine monitoring of our systems, we're willing to sign an agreement ensuring commercial partnerships. He paused, glaring at Morgan. However, we will not accept total subjugation of our sovereignty. You push us too far, we will strike back, no matter the cost. Morgan studied Navarth's face. We have no desire for the Empire to lose sovereignty. We do, however, wish to ensure that the Empire's future conquests do not destabilize galactic trade or harm Earth's interests. Darilla couldn't hold her tongue. You act like you're the galactic police, forbidding us from taking new planets. Morgan met her gaze. We prefer to call it a deterrent. If the Empire bombs another civilization into dust, Earth has the means to isolate your supply lines. We wouldn't be the only ones, either. Many smaller nations have accepted our assistance. They'd be more than willing to join in an embargo if it means weakening a mutual threat. A crack formed in Darilla's usual ironclad composure. So you threaten us with the very network you built under false pretenses of friendship. Morgan's expression was surprisingly sympathetic. We made no false pretenses, only partial disclosures. Our approach was never to destroy the Empire, but to show it that brute force is outdated in the galactic community we've shaped. Barath, leaning forward, rubbed his temples in frustration. And if we complied, if we restricted our militaristic expansion, what does Earth gain from us exactly? Morgan gave the slightest hint of a smile. Your Empire, harnessed, is an incredible resource. You have production lines that can build starships faster than any other. Your population is disciplined. Your organizational structure is second to none. These are strengths that, if channeled properly, make you valuable partners rather than tyrants to be opposed. Navarth's eyes flicked around the table. He could see varying degrees of shock, reluctance, and glimmers of understanding on the faces of his advisors. None of them had truly expected to be negotiating for the Empire's future on such uneven terms. In the end, faced with the overwhelming evidence of infiltration, the labyrinth of Earth alliances, and the promise of a stable empire that wouldn't bleed resources in endless wars, Navarth gave a short nod. Then let's see your proposed terms. They hashed out the details over the next few hours, some trivial, some monumental. Earth demanded the right to establish a permanent embassy on Altasar's capital planet, as well as seat observers within certain administrative bodies to ensure the Empire did not revert to unprovoked invasions. In return, Earth would share advanced medical technology and certain energy solutions that could revolutionize the Empire's starship propulsion. They also agreed to open trade routes, effectively linking Altasar's wealth with Earth's network. The final item was a mutual non-aggression clause. Any breach would trigger immediate retaliatory economic sanctions by Earth and its allies. By the time the document was ready to be signed, the sun of the capital planet had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the chamber. Morgan stood, pen in hand, and commented quietly, "I know you resent our methods, Grand Marshal, but you have my word that this outcome is far preferable to the alternative." Navarth stared at him, wariness and indignation burning in his eyes. "You say that as though we should thank you for not incinerating our station from the inside out. Is this your brand of mercy?" Morgan's voice remained even. "We have no interest in seeing any civilization fall. We adapted to survival in a galaxy full of stronger forces. Our methods, while unorthodox, kept us alive. And now they keep you from a war you cannot win." In that moment, Baroth recalled the last lines he'd read in the archive. Daniel Morgan, indicted war criminal, specialized in psychological warfare that compels a target civilization to capitulate voluntarily. He wondered if, in the quiet corners of Morgan's mind, this entire scenario was an inevitable step in Earth's steady expansion. Or perhaps there was some sincerity in Morgan's desire for a galaxy no longer ruled by terror. The line between war criminal and peacemaker had never felt so blurred. They signed the treaty. The instant the signing was done, Morgan's aides gave polite bows, promising to remove any remaining infiltration devices and set up official channels to share data transparently. The Altasar council members remained guarded, suspicious that Earth might have deeper traps. But once the documents were sealed, both sides left the chamber in a tense, uncertain peace. Word spread throughout the Empire. Altasar and Earth had forged an agreement that effectively ended the Empire's centuries-old model of conquest. Many were outraged at the perceived humiliation, while others breathed a sigh of relief at the promise of no further wars, at least for now. A few cycles later, an Earth embassy was established on Altasar's capital planet. It was an architectural monstrosity in typical Altasar style, overshadowing neighboring buildings with spires and statues that had once represented the Empire's might. Now, ironically, it housed Earth personnel who politely set up offices, advanced Earth's communications networks, and prepared to engage with local industries. Morgan was present at the ribbon-cutting ceremony, wearing that same calm smile. Standing beside him was Navarth, scowling but present out of obligation. The entire scene was surreal. The unstoppable Empire, once terrorizing half the galaxy, was now endorsing a new era of cooperation under the watchful eye of the very people they had dismissed as frail. The post-ceremony dinner was awkwardly pleasant. Morgan joked about how strong the Altasar gravity felt compared to Earth's, while Navarth quietly sipped a beverage, imported from Earth, ironically, and said little. Across the table, Darila engaged in a surprisingly civil debate with one of Morgan's aides about whether Altasar's advanced metallurgy could benefit Earth starships. Baroth observed it all with guarded curiosity, occasionally exchanging glances with Morgan. The look they shared was one of reluctant respect. Baroth had wanted to expose Morgan's infiltration from day one, to publicly condemn him as a war criminal. Instead, he found himself witnessing a new political reality. The Empire had not been destroyed, but it had been forced to evolve. In the weeks and months that followed, the dynamic became clearer. Earth's presence on Altasar's capital acted like a safety valve, preventing the Empire from launching campaigns of aggression by making it logistically impossible to do so without immediate economic repercussions. Meanwhile, Earth facilitated new trade with other regions the Empire had never bothered to court peacefully. The Empire's coffers filled. Its populace began to see tangible benefits from commerce instead of the spoils of war. Some grew content with that, while others bristled at the notion that they had lost the Empire's fierce soul. Behind the scenes, Morgan remained as vigilant as ever. He knew that his infiltration specialists were still active, albeit now in more formal ways, advising on trade negotiations, overseeing new data networks, ensuring that the Altasar never quite gained enough autonomy to revert to old ways. Baroth, for his part, quietly investigated whether Altasar could replicate the humans' tactics. Perhaps if they learned how to manipulate other civilizations in the same subtle fashion, they might reclaim a form of dominance. The two men ended up having clandestine conversations, each trying to glean insight from the other without revealing their own vulnerabilities. Rumors circulated that the Empire planned to send a new delegation to Earth. Officially, this was to further cultural exchange, but many suspected it was an intelligence-gathering mission, an attempt to find the humans' weak points. Did Earth truly have a robust defense fleet, or were they mostly bluffing? Was their home planet susceptible to ecological warfare? Morgan, naturally, anticipated these moves and seemed unconcerned. He assured his staff that Earth possessed enough contingency plans to handle any covert infiltration from Altasar. After all, infiltration was Earth's specialty. All this pointed to a delicate stalemate evolving into a complex mutual dependency. No longer was the galaxy governed by a single unstoppable empire. Rather, it was moving toward a network of alliances orchestrated by a species that had once been overlooked as soft, unspectacular, and technologically backward. The rest of the galaxy watched, some cheering for Earth's cunning approach, others lamenting that the glorious days of conquest might be ending. For the first time, peace did not rely solely on a supreme overlord. Instead, it emerged from a web of potential catastrophes, each side acknowledging that real war would be an act of mutual destruction. As for Morgan, he continued to play the part of a polite, affable diplomat. There were parties on Altasar that despised him, calling him a sly puppet master. Others credited him for saving them from a violent future. He received sealed communiques from Earth's other delegations across the galaxy, detailing how similar infiltration strategies had succeeded in forging nonviolent compliance. Sometimes he mused privately about whether the entire galaxy would one day be effectively run by Earth's intangible net of influence. Was that something to be proud of, or was it merely another form of imperialism wearing the mask of friendship? During one quiet evening in the newly established Earth Embassy, Morgan found himself alone at a window overlooking the capital's skyline. The shimmering lights of Altasar's monumental buildings, each built to signify the Empire's might, now felt oddly subdued. He pondered the path that had brought him here, the countless infiltration missions he had led. His original indictment as a war criminal had never really bothered him. He believed psychological warfare was a cleaner alternative to genocide, but he understood that others viewed his methods as insidious. Perhaps they were right. Yet Earth had thrived by turning enemies into allies, or, at least, into neutral parties. If that saved lives on both sides, was it so wrong? He heard footsteps. Baroth stood behind him, arms crossed. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Baroth said, "I'm not here to threaten you." That was a surprise, coming from a usually stern intelligence officer. Morgan waited, but Baroth continued with a grudging sincerity. "I've run the numbers. We're prospering under these new trade arrangements. I still hate how you forced us into it, but I'm not sure I hate the result." Morgan turned. "That's precisely why we did it. To show you a better outcome than endless conquest. You have to understand, we never intended to eradicate your empire, just to reform it." Baroth exhaled. "It still feels like we lost, but maybe losing in this manner is better than winning the old way." They exchanged a long, quiet look, as if acknowledging an uneasy respect. The Altasar were no longer the unstoppable war machine they once were, but they were thriving in different ways. And Earth, once dismissed as too weak to stand on its own, had orchestrated a transformation that reached far beyond a single empire. They had, in effect, captured the galaxy's biggest predator without firing a single shot. In the following cycles, as Earth and Altasar jointly announced new partnerships, including joint research facilities and cultural festivals, the galaxy braced itself for a new normal. Some cynics warned this was just another phase of Earth's infiltration, that one day the entire cosmos would be dancing to Earth's tune. Others argued that the Empire would always have the last word if it ever found a chance to break free from Earth's economic clutches. Yet, for the moment, war seemed a distant prospect, overshadowed by the bustle of trade ships crisscrossing routes once reserved for the Empire's war galleons. And so the final verdict was not that Altasar or Earth had won in the conventional sense. Rather, they found themselves in a precarious balance, each side possessing enough leverage to keep the other honest. The Altasar Empire was no longer a straightforward terror, unleashing fleets on defenseless planets. The humans were no longer dismissed as feeble nonentities. The entire galaxy learned that the mightiest weapon was not always the biggest gun, but the cunning to make your opponent realize that firing theirs would lead to their own downfall. Over time, scholars would write about this turning point as a milestone in interstellar politics. They would argue whether Morgan was indeed a war criminal or a visionary. Some would claim that Earth was simply replacing one empire with another, albeit in a subtler form. Others would insist that Earth's approach was far more benevolent than unrestrained imperial brutality. In the end, the truth might lie somewhere in between, a cosmic game of chess where Earth put the Altasar Empire in check, forcing a stalemate that gradually birthed an entirely new order. For the common folk of the Altasar worlds, life went on. Some found themselves actually enjoying Earth imports, from those peculiar beans used to brew coffee to the baffling, often hilarious array of Earth's entertainment. Soldiers who once marched off to war now found work in a booming trade security sector. Scientists who once researched destructive weapons collaborated with human researchers to create advanced terraforming projects. As for Navarth, the Grand Marshal spent many late nights wrestling with the knowledge that, while the Altasar crest still flew proudly, the Empire's unassailable rule had ended the moment humans walked through their door with that friendly, unsettling smile. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the station's corridors were largely empty, an observer might see both humans and Altasar milling about, nodding politely to each other in passing. A species that once believed wholeheartedly in the power of conquest, and a species that believed wholeheartedly in the power of manipulation had reached a tentative equilibrium. Some called it peace. Others called it a cold war disguised by trade deals and polite banquets. But whichever it was, it proved that in a galaxy filled with countless worlds, the most lethal war criminals might not be the ones dropping bombs. Sometimes, they were the ones who shook your hand, offered you a cup of coffee, and convinced you that there was no need to fire a shot at all.